Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for attending the RAPS webcast today. I appreciate you taking your time to attend, and hopefully it'll be a learning session for everyone. So first slide, please. So as Robin just mentioned, the company I started and founded 34 years ago is called Pacific Bridge Medical. Next slide, please. So basically, we've been helping medical device IVD companies in Asia over the last 34 years. We work in the regulatory reimbursement area as well as in business development. Next slide. We have 4 offices in Asia, in China, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and affiliate partners in all the other Asian markets. Our headquarters is located outside of Washington, D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland. Next slide. Asia, as most people on the line know, is a large geographic area. The purpose of today's webcast is to focus on Japan on the right side. Japan is a relatively large company, about 125 million people, but you can see the Asian markets are quite large. The population in Asia is about 3/5 of the world's population, over 5 billion people. And if you go from north to south, let's say from Tokyo in Japan down to Singapore, on the bottom of the slide, at the bottom of the Malay Peninsula, you have about a 7-hour plane ride. Also going east to west, if you look at the Indonesian islands on the bottom, if you go from the west side of the Indonesian islands to the east side of the Indonesian islands, it's about 3,000 miles, or the same width as the United States. Next slide, please. This just gives you some overall economic data on Asia. And of course, highlighting Japan is the per capita income, around 40,000 per year. Per capita GDP growth, very slow growth in Japan since the late 1980s or early 1990s. And you can see the GDP on a PPP basis, about $5 trillion. So the key thing to keep in mind is that things are very expensive in Japan. So the ability for people to buy things is quite expensive. And the incomes there are slightly or less than the United States, but significantly greater than in China. The other data has been updated for 2020. And for people interested in the region, hopefully this information will be helpful. Next slide, please. When you're thinking about Japan and then Asia, you have to think about the Asian ethnic diversity. Japan and Korea are generally very homogeneous. They have very small minority populations. Obviously, in Japan, there are some Koreans, and then there's a small number of immigrants from anywhere from India to Vietnam, to Europe, to US, etc. But Japan and Korea are very homogeneous populations. You can see on the other Asian markets, the populations can vary depending on ethnicity. Specifically, if you look at a country like Malaysia, 70% of the people are local Malay, 23% are Chinese, and approximately 7% are Indian. So this gives you a sense of the ethnic diversity in the region, with Japan being very homogeneous in general. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, before we get into the details on the Japan regulatory market, let's take a look at the size of the medical device markets. So you can see here on the left side, Japan, people estimate somewhere around $35 billion for the size of the Japanese medical device market. You can see now on the right side, though China is now at $45 billion. So the Chinese medical device market has surpassed the size of the Japan medical device market. But keep in mind that Japan still is a major player in the global marketplace. You can get a sense of the other sizes of the Asian countries on the right column, and some of the statistics on the left for US, Europe, Latin America, etc. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I think when companies are already in Japan, looking to increase their presence in Japan, or looking to enter Japan for the first time, there's many factors that foreign companies want to consider. So the main situation is, has the opportunity been confirmed by good primary research? What's the size and the growth rate of the market? It's important not to just think, okay, the product sells well in Europe or the product sells well in the US, so it must sell well in Japan. Each market is different, and you want to confirm the opportunity or the demand for your product by doing primary market research in Japan. Now, when you're doing primary market research in Japan, one of the first things you want to do is get to know the right Japanese KOLs, or key opinion leaders. Oftentimes, companies contact me and they say, well, in the US, we deal with Dr. Smith, and Dr. Smith introduced us to Dr. Fuji in Japan. So now we're working with Dr. Fuji in Japan. But then when I do a little investigation, I find out that Dr. Fuji in Japan is not really a top KOL. And there's no reason for the foreign company who's working with Mr. Smith, Dr. Smith in the United States, to work with Dr. Fuji in Japan. So it's very important when you're doing market research and you're trying to identify the demand for your product, as well as the KOLs in Japan are very influential in registration and reimbursement, to make sure you get the right KOLs on board. I can't tell you how many companies have not had the right KOLs on board in Japan, and then when it came to registration or reimbursement issues, their weight was not as significant as the foreign company thought. So another key issue is, will you need to do local clinical studies in Japan to get your product approved? Obviously, this can be a very expensive exercise, doing a local clinical study in Japan. And to the extent you can avoid that, you want to do that. So is a local clinical study in Japan required? And if so, what's the approximate cost and time frame to do the clinical study for your product registration in Japan? And then very important too is, does the reimbursement justify the investment? So will you get a reimbursement in Japan that is going to justify the investment in the registration, finding a distributor, setting up your own office, et cetera? And so a lot of times companies don't look into the reimbursement of their product in Japan until it's registered and they start to market the product, which at that point could be too late if the reimbursement is not adequate for profit for the company in Japan. So it's best to know up front, to make sure you have a profitable Japan business, what the reimbursement is likely to be or what the reimbursement will be in Japan. Keep in mind that Japanese people only will buy and use reimbursed devices, except for in situations like cosmetic surgery or cosmetic applications. So whereas many Asian countries and many places in the world, the reimbursement might be only 70%, and then the patient can pay 30% out of pocket to cover the cost of the device or the procedure. In Japan, people are not allowed actually to pay out of pocket for extra costs for devices and procedures. So the reimbursement becomes a key issue when you're looking to go into the Japanese market. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Japanese KOLs are crucial for registration, reimbursement, and in a lot of ways, they're godlike. So what I have here is a picture of a cheeseburger and a Japanese doctor, although the head is cut off. And we used to escort Japanese KOLs or Japanese doctors to different conferences in the US, like orthopedic conference or radiology conference here, or cardiology conferences. And when we were escorting these Japanese doctors, let's say we'd be at the Hilton Hotel outside of Chicago Airport, and at 3 in the morning, the Japanese KOL would call up to my partner who had escorted the Japanese doctors from Japan. So he's a Japanese guy. The Japanese KOL would call my partner and request a cheeseburger at 3 in the morning. And of course, my partner, a Japanese guy who was at the Hilton Hotel too with the KOLs, would call the room service, order a cheeseburger. The cheeseburger would be delivered to my partner's office, who then would take it over to the Japanese doctor's office. So this kind of service and this kind of respect for KOLs is common in Japan. And of course, at 3 in the morning, the Japanese KOL could have called the room service. Their English was good enough, but that's not what they expected. So keep in mind that Japanese KOLs are still godlike in Japan. And generally, people don't go see a doctor in Japan and say, well, you know, I saw this on the internet, I could take this drug or I could do this procedure. What do you think? People go to the doctors in Japan, they're normally fairly passive and listening to what the Japanese doctor or KOL has to say. Next slide, please. So I think a lot of people on the call today are familiar with the Japan regulatory bodies. Obviously, the PMDA is the main, the PMD is the Pharmaceutical and Medical Device Act, which governs medical device regulations in Japan. The top government agency in the healthcare area is the Ministry of Health and Welfare, MHLW. The PMDA, who most people may have some idea about, is a division of the MHLW that approves devices. And then if you have a class 2 or sometimes a class 3 product that doesn't need a PMDA approval, you can get the product approved through a registered certified body. And the registered certified bodies are subject to periodic check on their qualifications by the PMDA. So next slide, please. So the Japan Medical Device Classification is obviously a key process in the registration of your device in Japan. Japan device classification is primarily determined by the JMDN codes and also by substantial equivalence with predicates in Japan. Keep in mind that in Japan, there are 4 classes, not the 3 classes that we see in most Asian, European, and US markets. So you may have a class 2 product in the United States or a 510K, but that could be considered and classified as a class 3 product in Japan. Class 1 products just require notification, relatively simple to register. As I mentioned, class 2 and some class 3 products can get approvals from notified bodies like BSI, TUV, etc. But most class 3 and all class 4 products require PMDA approval. Now, when you look at the class 3 and 4 registrations, keep in mind there are a number of subcategories. Me too or generic. There's an existing JMD code based on a technical file that is already registered. Also in class 3 and 4, you have improved. There's an existing JMDM code based on a new technical file. You can have a product that's new in class 3 or 4 where there's no appropriate JMDM code. And also keep in mind that IVDs in Japan are only registered through 3 classes, not 4 like medical devices. And then if the classification is not clear or you're not sure whether a medical device is considered a medical device in Japan and requires registration, you can normally discuss that with the Regulatory Affairs Division of the local prefecture. And in most cases, this will be the Tokyo metropolitan government in the Tokyo area. Next slide, please. This chart just goes through some of the classifications of non-IVD medical devices and gives you a little more information on how many of class 1, 2, 3, and 4 products have been, how many products have been classified according to their JMDA code in each of the classifications, the names of the categories, and also the pre-market regulations. Who can approve the products if they're Class B or some Class C products can be through, as I mentioned, an independent third party is certified review by RCB, or the higher risk products, Class 3 and 4, mostly going to the PMDA. And it gives you some examples of the products on the left too, just so you can see which products are classified in certain categories. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about the registration routes and timetables for registration. So if you have a JMDA code and it's a class 1, 2, 3 product, the class 1 products are substantially equivalent with predicates. They're low risk. No QMS is required, but remember, you cannot transfer class 1 registrations from one entity to another. You'd have to do a re-registration. Class 2 and some class 3 products that have substantially equivalent with certification criteria can take the notified body route. And normally we say for class 2 and 3 products approved through a notified body around 9 to 12 months for approval. Class 3 and some Class 4 products, PMDA review and depends on substantial equivalence as well as predicates. Again, they're the subcategories. And normally, if a Class 3 or 4 product does not need a local clinical study in Japan, the registration timeframes are normally 12 to 18 months. However, some Class 4 new devices where there's no JMDM code could take as long as 24 months without a clinical study. And then if you need to do a clinical study, oftentimes the case for Class 3 and Class 4 products, you normally have to add 1 or 2 years, 12 to 24 months. So these are the basic time frames for registration in Japan. The time chains have not changed. The time frames to get products registered have not changed much over the last 5 years. And still today, these time frames are pretty good. Of course, if you have problems with your dossier or too many questions from the PMDA and you have delays in answering those questions from the PMDA, these time frames can be expanded. But this gives you a general sense of overall time frames for complete dossiers and situations where most information is available. Next slide, please. So then, on the registration route, the issue is you have a product, you may not be sure about the registration route, or you don't know if a local clinical study is required for registration. So what do you do if you have questions about the registration path or the classification of your product in Japan? So there are a number of consultative sessions in Japan where you can meet with the PMDA to discuss your product, the registration path, the need for clinical studies, etc. So the first thing you normally do is have a free PMDA consultation. This consultation has no charge to the government. You don't pay a fee to the government, and it normally lasts about 30 minutes. And normally after this free consultation, the PMDA will advise which formal PMDA consultation you should attend next. During the free PMDA consultative session, the PMDA will normally not answer too many questions, but it's always good to have a short PowerPoint presentation for the free PMDA consultative session meeting. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, for the free consultative session, you may need to submit a short PowerPoint on your company and product. Again, if you're going to bring any KOLs to consultative meetings with the PMDA, make sure that they're the right KOLs, that they're really high-level people, not mid-level Japanese doctors. You don't need to bring a KOL to the first free consultative session. That would be only helpful, I think, on the formal consultative sessions, which we'll discuss next. And of course, you want to do a rehearsal on the PMDA meeting, who will speak when, which people won't speak, which slides to emphasize before you meet with the PMDA. So you have a limited time to meet with them. The PMDA officials are very high ranking in Japan, expect things to be done right. So you want to make sure you have a short, to the point presentation so you can get their feedback on which next formal PMDA consultation to attend. Next slide, please. Okay. So this slide talks about the formal consultative meetings with the PMDA. Keep in mind that these meetings, when you go to a formal PMDA consultation meeting with the formal PMDA consultation meeting, you have to pay a government fee. So depending on the meeting, you have to pay different government fees. The fees can range normally from $5,000 to $20,000 to the government for the PMDA formal consultative meeting. So it will depend on which formal consultation meeting you attend. Also, it's often good to have a simultaneous translation at these PMDA formal consultative meetings. And normally when we do these meetings, we always recommend 2 translators as opposed to 1 in case there's a problem. And so the company that goes to these formal PMDA consultative meetings also needs to pay the translation fee or translator's fee in addition to the government fee. So the first PMDA consultative meeting here, the Zenpan Sudan, it's a general introductory class consultation. Again, we're going to bring a short PowerPoint, a little longer than the one we did on the free consultative meeting. And we want to go with some specific questions that we're going to ask the PMDA to address either at the meeting or after the meeting so we can get some of their feedback. So oftentimes you need to go to this Zenpan Sudan consultative meeting with the PMDA. The next meeting is a pre-development consultation where you review information, including required testing, as a local clinical trial recommended, supporting data of your product in the registration path is also normally presented during this second PMDA consultative meeting. And then if you're not sure still after the first two meetings about a clinical trial or whether foreign clinical data can be accepted, or there's some discrepancy on how many cases for the clinical trial you may want to have, you can go to a clinical trial formal PMDA consultative meeting, Rinsho Yohi Sudan meeting. And here you can discuss whether your non-clinical data is sufficient. You can present foreign clinical data and protocol and see if you need to do a clinical study in Japan, and if so, maybe what some of the criteria of the clinical trial will be. Can you follow the same protocol you followed in the US or Europe? How many patients, etc. So on the second to last bullet point, you can see here, each meeting has different government fees and different presentation requirements. And you want to make sure that you budget time for the meetings. And keep in mind that the PMDA is quite busy. So you may not be able to get your first meeting with the PMDA after the free consultative for another 4 months. So try to plan out the meetings accordingly and budget your time. Okay, so if you're not sure about the regulatory path, you're not sure about the need for local clinical study, these PMDA consultative meetings can be very helpful, but you want to be well prepared and make sure your presentation and the people at the meetings are very knowledgeable about your product and the regulatory path so that you can maximize these meetings. Next slide, please. So this chart just gives you a diagram of the PMDA consultation menus. So there are a number of different PMDA consultative meetings that you can attend. And you can see some of them have to do with pre-development, non-clinical tests, clinical trials, application preparation. And so the point of this slide isn't to make you go crazy. The point of the slide is to show you there are a number of different PMDA consultations that may be appropriate to determine the registration path in Japan. Okay, next slide, please. So for the registration, what do you need to do? What do you have to submit to get approval? So we have a Japanese dossier application and a STED. In addition to these documents, a QMS application is required, and the QMS audit will either be on paper or on site. Normally, if it's not a really risky product and there's not a really risky product, it'll be a paper or on-site audit. And if it's a very risky product and the COVID situation is not too bad, the PMDA may visit your company and your factory and do an on-site audit. Keep in mind that the QMS application needs to be renewed every 5 years. And the QMS application will include the product information, manufacturing flowchart information, floor plan, ISO 13485 certificate, quality manual, etc., based on MHLW Ordinance 169, which is for QMS. In addition to the dossier, the STED, the QMS application, you also need to do an FMR application, Foreign Manufacturing Registration Application, FMR. In 2014, the Japanese government changed this requirement from a foreign manufacturing accreditation, FMA, to a foreign manufacturing registration. With the FMA, there were more facilities that needed to be audited, and with the FMR, fewer facilities need to be accredited. Now only the design facility, the main assembly plant, the sterilization site, the domestic distribution center need to be accredited. And the paper exercise is not complicated, but they do require a significant amount of information. So in situations where you have a risky device, in addition to the dossier application, STED, QMS, and FMR applications, you could have a reliability investigation application. But again, this is only for risky devices. Next slide, please. So the next 5 or 6 slides, we have some of the required documents or items for Japanese FMR, Japanese QMS, Japanese dossier, etc. So on this first slide, we have required items for the Japanese FMR application. I think these are fairly self-explanatory: the name of the applicant, name of the manufacturing site, the address of the manufacturing site. Sometimes what's not quite so evident is on number 6, the personal history of the responsible person. So normally we have to ask the client to fill out a PMDA template form. The form needs to be completed by the president or the CEO or the general manager or the factory manager at the site. This is important, and also that they're also wondering for a resume or qualifications of the person that's responsible. Obviously, a map to show the manufacturing site, etc. Next slide, please. So those were the main requirements for the FMR. And now what we did was listed the required items for a class 2 or class 3 medical device application. So again, I'm presenting this information so you know what's required. A lot of the information is self-explanatory, but we'll try to hit on a few points. Let's look at number 4, spec test report. Lots of spec test reports to support the safety and effectiveness of the product based on the Japanese standard, approval criteria, and/or such examples below. So here we have on the right, on the memo, on the spec test report, number 4, the declaration of conformity document, which will be attached to the application. This is a declaration that the applicant has confirmed the conformity of the tests showing the effectiveness and safety of the product. On items number 5, you can see there's some more specification testing reports according to IEC standards, ISO standards. Again, I think these are pretty self-explanatory. Next slide, please. So this slide continues with class 2 and class 3 product registrations, additional items that need to be in the application. The first one there, the risk analysis report based on ISO 14971. And then you can see some other things. Number 8, comparison chart with the predicate device or devices. On number 11, approval in other global markets is always helpful in Japan, but not required. And then when you submit the application, you need to have an MAH or DMAH in Japan. MAH being market authorization holder, DMAH being a designated market authorization holder. So we'll get into this a little later, but the MAH or the DMAH could be your own office in Japan, it could be your distributor in Japan, or it could be an independent third party in Japan. But you need to have an entity in Japan, either your own, a distributor, or an independent third party to submit your application to the PMDA to get the approval. You can't submit applications from overseas without a local office submitting on your behalf. Okay, next slide, please. So we also talked about the QMS application. As you know, QMS application being required as well as the dossier STED and FMR application. So the QMS is similar to ISO 13485, but it's not identical, so keep that in mind. It could be or a paper audit, we talked about that. Japan is going to be starting to accept MDSAP applications as of April 1st this year, 2022. And basically there's a better chance of just doing a paper audit as opposed to an on-site audit if we have the ISO certificate or the MDSAP. So some people asked me in the past, if we have MDSAP, do we need to do a QMS application? So the answer to that question is yes. Even if you have MDSAP, you need to do a QMS application. But again, the chances of an on-site audit become significantly reduced if you've done an MDSAP application already. And again, the QMS application needs to be reviewed every 5 years. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide basically goes through the requirements for the QMS application. Again, focusing on the ISO 13485. Number 8, a quality manual of the client. When number 10, Seihin Hajun Show is a template, is like the outline of the device master file, similar in construction to the European technical file. However, there's additional information placed into the file specific to Japanese regulatory requirements and the market authorization holder. Okay, so these are the requirements for the QMS application. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, for risky devices, normally class 3, class 4 products, you may have to have a reliability application too. This is normally done simultaneous with the product application review, and the reliability investigation reviews the non-clinical test reports to show compliance with the essential requirements. Normally one sample report is reviewed by the PMDA, and also evidence documents related to the sample report will be studied closely, including test records, test protocols, etc. So this is the reliability investigation for risky products we're required to for your application for product registration in Japan. Next slide, please. I'm not going to speak too much about other key regulatory issues, but obviously the product labels must be in Japanese, include a barcode. IFUs have to be in Japanese. Electrical appliances similar to UL mark in the US and Europe. Radio Act, Measurement Act to measure patient parameters, etc. So there are some other regulations besides the one we've talked about for product approval. So please keep these in mind too. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned initially, one of the things you want to consider initially is, is there demand for the product? Are there KOLs that are real KOLs that support your technology in Japan? Is there going to be reimbursement to make the sale of the product in Japan profitable for your company? And also the issue on clinical trials. If you have a unique product, are foreign clinical trials accepted? Will you need to do local clinical trials, etc.? And as I mentioned, there's a PMDA consultative session on clinical trials to get more details on that. So normally local clinical trials are required in Japan for improved or new devices where the safety and efficacy is not validated by non-clinical data. Can your Western clinical trials suffice? Well, when you're doing Western clinical trials in Europe or US, please make sure that you set those trials up according to Japanese GCP standards. Even though the trials are being done in the US and Europe, if they're done according to Japanese GCP standards, it'll be easier for foreign clinical data to be accepted in Japan. When you talk about Japanese GCP standards, the main standard there is to have a just Japanese investigator or a KOL on board with your foreign clinical studies. I can't tell you how many companies do studies in the US and Europe, but they don't do it according to Japanese GCP standards, and they don't have a Japanese investigator. This only comes back to haunt you later on. Also, if you're doing clinical trials in the US and Europe, can you get Japanese patients in the US and Europe into your clinical trials there? So if you have a number of Japanese patients in the US in your US clinical study, that's only going to help you in Japan, and oftentimes can reduce the number of clinical studies you need to do on local Japanese patients in Japan if a Japanese clinical trial is required. And the third bullet point here, what we seem to find is that the PMDA seems to accept more foreign data from larger Western device companies, and normally it's a little tougher for smaller Western device companies with unique products to get approvals in Japan just using foreign data. But sometimes foreign data is strong enough that even a small company can get that to be accepted in Japan. So it really depends on your negotiations with the PMDA. And again, if you have to do a local trial, make sure you have the right KOLs and the right CRO company. We've been doing this work for over 30 years, and we've seen some companies fail with their clinical trials in Japan. They chose the wrong CRO, or they did the clinical trial with the wrong KOL, and the trial came out okay, but the KOL really didn't have much weight in the Japan medical community, so it was more difficult to get the product approved in Japan. Next slide, please. Also, you may know that over the last, 7, 8 years, there's been harmonization by doing, so doing clinical trials in Japan and the US at the same time. So instead of conducting a full clinical trial in Japan and then the full clinical trial in Japan, the goal is to save time and money. So sometimes we see you're doing a joint clinical trial in Japan and US using the same protocol. And of course, when you're doing this, you need to make sure that the descriptions and the product descriptions and the other clinical trial information is pretty much identical in both markets. Not too many companies, though, from my knowledge, doing harmonization by doing, but maybe it's important if you're going forward and you can try to do the trial in both locations. Next slide, please. Okay, so basically this slide just talks about the fact that the PMDA raised the registration fees or the user fees by 8 to 15%, depending on the classification of your product in Japan. And it says here a new class 4 device costs approximately $150,000 in Japan. And then the PMDA on the third bullet point also raised the fee for device changes, change modification submissions. The prices now will be about half the price of a new registration. And then on the last couple of points, we have the fees there for the government fees for the PMDA for your QMS application and also for the FMR application. On the FMR, keep in mind if there are multiple locations related to the products that are shipped to Japan, all those multiple sites need to be FMR approved, and all the facilities to be included in the QMS application need to be FMR'd, or foreign manufacturing registration approved too. Next slide, please. There are some more expedited processes to get your product approved in Japan. The SAKI Gate has been around about 10 years. It's basically for innovative medical devices and in vitro diagnostic products for patients in urgent need of innovative therapies. It can be a product can be designated as a SAKI Gate if it's a pre-market application will be filled in Japan first or simultaneously in some countries. including Japan. And let's say on the bottom here, the medical device IVD is designated. If the medical device and IVD is designated as SAKI Gate quick approval, the manufacturer can enjoy the following benefits. Prioritize consultation by the PMDA, pre-application substantive review, a little quicker there, prioritize review, and some kind of like concierge or more attention by the government to the registration process to expedite matters. Next slide, please. This is just a chart showing graphically how this SAKI Gate designation system works. On the top, you can see the standard review, and then on the bottom, you can see the review under the SAKI Gate. So you can see here that with the blue arrows, that on the top, on the standard review, it's 2 months. Consultation on the clinical trial, below it's only 1 month. Prior review, as opposed to just a regular review, the prior review may being 6 months, as opposed to regular review being 12 months. And it shows you how you can get a quicker approval using the SAKI Gate if your product fits into the SAKI Gate designation. Next slide, please. This chart just gives you some illustrations of SAKI Gate designated medical devices and IVDs. This is the 4th round of products that was approved not so long ago. There's been 3 other rounds of products that were approved by SAKI Gate designation. And this is just for your information, so you get a sense of this is happening for some products in Japan today. Next slide, please. Also, some companies now with device raw materials or device components, but not finished products, are looking to file Japan medical device master files, sort of similar to the concept of a drug master file. The current master file system for device raw materials or components was established in 2019. Again, if you want to do this, you need to first attend a consultative session with the PMDA to make sure that your product will be classified, is classifiable as in the device master file system in Japan. And the Japan government, the PMDA, is actually fairly picky on which products they'll allow to have a device master file for, so you have to have this consultation session first. If the PMDA agrees that your raw material component is appropriate, then the foreign manufacturer can start to prepare a submission dossier for a Japan medical device master file registration. After the application is accepted by the PMDA, it will take about 15 days or so for the master file registration to be issued to the foreign manufacturer. So sometimes companies want to protect their intellectual property on their device component or raw material, and they can do so through the Japan medical device master file system now. Next slide. Next slide basically gives you the document requirements if you want to file for Japan medical device master file. I think this is fairly straightforward, so we'll leave this for you to review on your own and turn to the next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about health insurance in Japan and reimbursement. As I mentioned when we started the webcast, the reimbursement issue is crucial in Japan. If your product is similar to an existing product, it'll probably go into an existing reimbursement code. If your product is unique and you want to get a higher reimbursement, your product will you'll probably have to submit some strong health economics data to increase reimbursements. Now in Japan, everybody has insurance, health insurance. And as I mentioned before, people will not use medtech products or have certain surgeries that are not reimbursed by the government. So everybody is taking advantage of full reimbursement by the government on devices, procedures, and drugs that are used by the Japanese people. Thus, the reimbursement issue is crucial for product sales. So why register a product if you're planning to sell the product in Japan for $100 but the Japan reimbursement is only $90. So do you want to have a business in Japan that's losing $10 on every product you sell there? Again, the reimbursement is crucial for your Japanese business planning. Okay, now Chukyo is the Central Social Insurance Medical Council, which makes the final reimbursement decisions. And keep in mind, that the healthcare system in Japan is very different than in the United States. In Japan, the average hospital stay is 25 days, and normally 1 week for mothers for newborns. Here, if you have a baby in the States or Europe, I think after 2 or 3 days, you're going home with your baby. Not the case in Japan. So the government is losing lots of money because of these long hospital stays in Japan, because the government's paying for the healthcare. So device reimbursement in general is dropping a bit each year in Japan for medical devices. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Japan has universal health insurance, and people are not allowed by law to use non-reimbursed products and pay for the difference between the reimbursement and the cost of the product. But the other point here is that different age groups and different types of workers have different copays. And again, if there's going to be self-pay examples, it's normally in cosmetic procedures, maybe LASIK or tattoo removal, things like that. And then it's important, again, for the device companies, when you're registering your products, to think about reimbursement. And normally reimbursement is awarded about 6 months after the product approval. It can be quicker than that, and it can be longer than that if you're trying to get higher reimbursement. Okay, next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, GQ is the key agency of reimbursement. It's under the MHLW. However, the Health Insurance Bureau does the initial assessment and provides its evaluation to Chukyo. The reimbursement in Japan is typically determined by 2 factors: which functional reimbursement category your product falls into, and the foreign reference pricing. Those are the two dynamics for reimbursement in Japan and how reimbursement is determined. So to get reimbursement, again, it's very important to get some strong support from your Japanese KOLs, key opinion leaders, and from appropriate associations. If you have a radiology product, there's a number of radiology associations. So you want to figure out which radiology association is best to support and try to get their support when it comes to increasing reimbursement in Japan, if you need to increase it above the basic levels. And people should look into reimbursement issues early on, not after the product's registered, but during the registration process or before you start the registration process. Line up the right KOL and association and see if you can get their support when it comes time for reimbursement. And trying to get increased reimbursement is not easy and will require excellent health economic data. Generally, both clinical and economic evidence may be needed to increase reimbursements in Japan today. Next slide. So the MHLW looks for examples of similarly priced devices. Chikyu systematically reviews foreign reference prices, I mentioned that. And the maximum limits for the reimbursement prices for Japan are 1.25 times the unweighted average of the prices in 5 countries: France, Germany, the UK, United States, and Australia. Please note that instead of 1.25, the ratio is 1.3 times applied for reevaluation of already reimbursed medical devices. But the government now is trying to reduce this from 1.3 to 1.25 also. And oftentimes the reimbursement price in the US is the highest. So Chikyu will drop the highest price and average the other 4 countries, or sometimes they'll drop the 2 highest prices of the 5 countries and take an average of the remaining 3 countries. So it's a little tricky on the reimbursement here and the formulas that are involved to get Japanese reimbursement. And the more you know, the easier it'll be for you to maneuver within the reimbursement system there. Next slide, please. So in the functional categories, There's functional categories A, B, and C in Japan. Functional category A1, A2, and 3, it's a physician fee, comprehensive. 2 and 3, we'll see. Categories B1, B2, 3 are more geared toward high-priced consumables. And there's an existing functional category for B1, B2, B3, and C1, C2. These are for increased reimbursement over what's currently available in Japan today. So if you have a unique product, your product may fall into the C1 reimbursement category, where there's a new functional category, or in C2, there's both a new function and a new technical fee. So the next slide will go into this in a little more detail, but these are the functional reimbursement categories in Japan today. Next slide, please. So the next few slides actually goes into a little more detail on these functional reimbursement categories. So here we have categories, functional categories A1, 2, and A3. So you can see like A3 is an existing A1, 2 functional category reimbursement, but there's a new usage. So the use is new, even though it's authorized in one of the existing reimbursement categories, A1 or A2 above. Next slide, please. This one goes into the functional reimbursement categories for products in the B1, B2, B3 reimbursement categories. And here you get a little more information on the B1, B2, and B3. B1, for example, there's an existing functional category, a technical fee, and separate device fee, reimbursable at the exact same price as an existing functional group. So if one drug-eluting stent is reimbursed at $1,200 and you have a very similar product, the reimbursement could also be $1,200. Of course, if your drug-eluting stent has some new features and new categories, you can maybe move into B2 or B3 classification, or even try for reimbursement categories C1 and C2. Next slide, please. So here again, these are the reimbursement categories for C1 and C2. Again, C1, these are devices that are based on an existing therapy or product. A technical fee exists for the procedure, but a new functional category is needed. So a technical fee exists on the C1. On the C2, a technical fee does not exist. So in the C2 category, there's both a new function and a new technical fee. Now, to get into the C1, C2 categories, this is where you normally need to provide strong health economic data, maybe some additional clinical trial information, et cetera, because these are reimbursement categories where you need to negotiate to get higher fees, higher prices. Next slide, please. So these are some other facts about Japan reimbursement. So we already talked about C1 and C2 categories. C1 is for the new function, C2 is for new function, new technical fee. The number of C1, C2 approvals for increased reimbursement above the A and B levels is not many, maybe about 25 products per year. And everybody hopes that their product will be approved in the C1 or C2 reimbursement category, but that's definitely not the case. As I already mentioned, strong health economics and KOL and the trade association support is a must, but there's no clear guidance on health technology assessments or what is exactly required. And as I mentioned, the time to get new products into the C1 and C2 reimbursement categories can take longer than 6 months. So you get the product approved. If you go into a standard category, a reimbursement category, maybe it's just a couple months to get into that reimbursement category. If you go for a new higher pricing, then you're going for a C1, C2 reimbursement category, and it could take longer than 6 months. And also cost calculation and cost comparison may be used for products to determine the premiums or increases in the C1, C2 reimbursement increases. Cost calculation and cost comparison with other products on the marketplace. Next slide, please. So this is important for people to know. You know, if you were doing Japanese medical device reimbursement like we were 25 years ago or 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, the reimbursements in Japan were sky high. So what we saw 15 years, 20 years ago was that a company, let's say it's $1 billion in sales company, and the company sold $100 million of the billion in Japan. So their sales in Japan were $100 million. The sales globally were $1 billion. So if you looked at the profitability of the company, though, the profitability of the company might have been 10% on the sales outside of Japan, but because the reimbursements were so high back then in Japan, the profitability in the sales in Japan could be 20% of the company's profits. But those reimbursements have come down dramatically over the last 10 or 15 years. And now the Medical Economic Division of the Health Insurance Bureau states that the reimbursement price in Japan should absolutely be lower than that of the United States. The government there in Japan is going bankrupt with the healthcare. People stay in hospitals 25 days. So the PMDA, MHLW, they're absolutely trying to reduce medical device reimbursements. And you can see here, the Medical Economic Division is said to have a life or death power. And so foreign manufacturers may lose if they claim too much when trying to get higher reimbursements. Good results or efficacy are important, but so is reduced recurrence and reduced hospital time. So to the extent your device or the procedure with the device can save people time so they're not at the hospital 25 days, so the government doesn't have to pay for the facility and for the care for the person for that long, all the better. And while the reimbursement goes down every 2 years, keep in mind that the PMDA is providing more money and higher prices for some unique or high-need products. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are two ways to look at the reimbursement in Japan. The one is the functional codes, ABC, we just went over that. And the second is the foreign reference pricing. So we talked a little about the foreign reference pricing and 1.3 or 1.25 over the average unweighted prices in 5 countries: England, France, Germany, US, and Australia. But keep in mind, there have also been some additional formulas added to these reimbursements when determining foreign reference pricing. So as you can see here on the second bullet point, if the product price in one of the comparison countries is more than 2.5 times more than the product price in the lowest foreign reference country, the highest price country will be discarded, and the foreign reference pricing will be determined on the basis, the foreign average price will be determined on the basis of the remaining 4 countries. The ratio is a reduction from the previous figure of 3 times. Okay, so if the price is more than 2.5 in the highest country versus the lowest country, then the price is reduced. On the next dash there, if the highest price is more than 1.8 times the average of the other 4 countries, the maximum price will be set at 1.8 times. This is down from the previous ratio of 2 times. And then for your information, the government wants to reduce this 1.8 to 1.6. So keep in mind, oftentimes the reimbursement or the pricing in the United States is the highest. So GQ will drop the US price and average the other 4 countries, or sometimes they'll even drop the 2 highest prices, usually the US and Australia, and just average the remaining 3 countries. So these are additional formulations for foreign reference pricing that you want to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So we're going to quickly go through a Japanese reimbursement example. And in this case, let's say the US company has a product called X, and the product is a bone substitute product. And their bone substitute product has a small amount of drug that makes their product unique. So the question we had was, will the Japanese reimbursement system give this US company increased reimbursement because of the uniqueness of their products over other similar products? So what we did then is we looked at the functional reimbursement categories and the foreign reference pricing categories to try to determine what the reimbursement in Japan would be for this bone substitute product. Next slide, please. So in the functional classification, we looked at some of the competing products. And remember, none of the competing products had a little drug in the product, so it's not exactly direct competitors. But one competitor had a generic name called reabsorbable material for bone regeneration. And in this case, the reimbursement was $129 per cc. And it was in the B1 reimbursement functional category. Another competitive product was about $148 per cc, and it was in the B2 functional category. Next slide. So we also looked at general reimbursement levels for artificial bones and artificial bone substitutes. And you can see on a CC basis, the different prices we found, going anywhere from 63 cents to $148 per cc. Okay, next slide, please. Also, there's different books you can check in Japan, which will give you information on functional reimbursement categories and details onto, in this case, bone substitute type product. And you can see on the first column, the B2s are relating to the chapter and section of the medical remuneration table that we're looking at. The second column, the 078, refers to artificial bones. And the third column there is talking about the functional classification, but not for a specific body part, et cetera. So this information in Japanese is available for people to look at when they're trying to determine which functional reimbursement category your reimbursement may occur in, your product may fit into. Next page, please. Okay, so here we did is we looked at, now we're going from the functional reimbursement scenario to the foreign reimbursement scenario. And we focused primarily on the 1cc because that's where we got some of the information on the functional reimbursement category. So you can see here for this bone substitute in the US, the reimbursement was $750 per cc, Australia, $550, Germany, $210. They were still under consideration in France at about $170 per cc, UK and Canada. So you can see the US price is the highest, Australia is the second highest, and then Germany, France, UK, and Canada, all about the same prices with regard to foreign reference pricing. Next slide, please. So again, we have, for the foreign reference pricing, we have to apply some of the other formulas I talked about a few slides back. So the foreign reference pricing is calculated now is only 2.5 times as allowed as the difference between the highest and lowest price. And in this example, France had the lowest price at $170 from the previous slide, and 170 times 2.5 equals $425 per cc. So the highest price in this case in the US at $750 per cc needs to be omitted, because when you multiply the lowest price in France times 2.5, the highest price can only be $425. And then after the highest price is omitted, the second highest price can only be recognized as the average price, including the first and second highest prices. So second highest prices. So in this case, the average of the UK, France, and Germany is about $201 per cc. As a result, the Australian price is recognized as 363, 201, which is the average of the other three countries times 1.8. So again, these are the formulas we talked about several slides ago. Therefore, the foreign average pricing is around $240, $42 per cc. That's the average price of Australia, Germany, France, and the UK. Okay, next slide, please. So what we do here is we're taking a look at both the functional reimbursement and the foreign reference pricing to come up with the reimbursement for this orthopedic bone filler product. So the functional reimbursement prices are a lot less than the foreign reference prices. So the functional reimbursement prices, the average was around $138 a cc. The foreign reference pricing was around $242 per cc. And so the likely pricing we say is around $200 per cc. So if we want to increase the pricing closer to the 242 foreign reference pricing and not have to worry so much about the functional reimbursement pricing, strong economic data has to be utilized, and we have to reduce the time for healing and show less time in the hospital, et cetera. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned initially, if you're registering your products in Japan, you can register your products through your own subsidiary office in Japan, through your distributor and distributor's office in Japan, or through an independent third-party DMH or MAH system. So this is like we have an office in Japan, which we offer DMH and MAH services. So only local companies with the marketing authorization holder license are able to register your products and then import the products into Japan. And as I mentioned, you have three options. One is the subsidiary, the distributor, or an independent third party. And then if a foreign company does not want to set up their own subsidiary in Japan, if it's a small to mid-sized foreign company, you either want to find, qualify, and sign up an excellent Japanese distributor who can be your local MAH, or you want to hire or work with an independent third party in Japan to act as your MAH or DMAH. Okay, next slide, please. So just for people that are interested, there are three types of MAH licenses, types 1, 2, and 3. Those correlate to the different device classifications. So if you want to register a class 3 device, you need to have a class 1 MAH license. You also, IVDs have different licenses than medical devices. So if you have a third-party independent DMAH, MAH in Japan, and you have an IVD product, you need to make sure that that DMAH, MAH has an IVD MAH license, not just a medical device license. The MAH is your primary connection, deals with the PMDA on your behalf. And the MAH has the legal obligation to make sure that the products reach the marketplace safely. And when you're using the independent third-party MAH system, you must receive the products in the MAH's warehouse. A quality check is done at the warehouse before the products are released to your Japanese distributor or to some other distribution mechanism in the Japanese market. Okay, the MAH must have 1 to 3 controllers, depending on the size of the risk of the device, whether it's class 1, 2, or 3 device. The next few slides, next slide, please. The next slide talks about, does it make sense to have an independent third-party DMAH, or would you have your distributor register the products? Normally what I say is if the expected sales in Japan are going to be over, let's say 1.5 million, then registering through an independent third-party DMAH, MAH makes sense. But keep in mind that independent third-party DMAH, MAH registration is expensive because you have the registration fees that'll be paid to the third-party DMAH. You have the warehouse fees to store your products before a quality check is done and they're released to the marketplace. And there's monthly DMAH fees. And so before you decide to use an independent third-party MEH, which has lots of advantages over the distributor holding your registration, mainly the registrations are in your name, not the distributor's name. So if the distributor doesn't perform, you can cancel the registration. You can transfer to a new distributor and you hold the registrations independently. Also, confidential information, if it's required for registration while it's submitted to an independent third-party MEH, is normally kept confidential, whereas if you give confidential information to a distributor to register your products in Japan, hopefully they keep the information confidential, but you may not know about that. So oftentimes independent third-party DMAH, MEH makes sense, but for those advantages, there is a cost. I'd like to skip through the next few slides because they just go over how the let's go back one slide. This goes through the differences between what a DMAH and MAH. I mean, basically, a DMAH, the foreign manufacturer has control over the registration. With MAH, the local agent is control of the registration, not the foreign manufacturer. But if you have a third party and they're acting as an MAH, not a DMAH, the registration's in the MAH's name, but you can still tell the MAH to transfer to another MAH if you want to switch MAHs. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. The next few slides basically just give you a graphic illustration of how documents flow and how the product flow works for DMAH, and also how the money flows for DMAH. Of course, if your business in Japan is quite good and you want to set up your own subsidiary, that's okay too. So, but setting up a subsidiary and office in Japan can be expensive, and you need to think that out very carefully before you do it. Next slide, please. Software as a medical device. Today, software is being registered as a standalone item in Japan, not as a part of medical equipment. And in April of 2021, the PMDA set up a new office that was dedicated to software as medical device product registrations. More software as a medical device is being registered in Japan now than it was a few years ago. Next slide, please. Okay, to succeed in Japan, you need to familiarize yourself with the Japanese culture. Japanese are normally formal, detail-oriented, and very conservative. Japanese people are not usually paid to take risks. And doing business in Japan requires that you establish a long-term trusting relationship with your employees, with your distributors people, with your third-party DMH, etc. And keep in mind with Japanese culture, if you're sending an email to Japanese counterparts, you don't want to say, "Dear Mr. Fuji, attached are 3 documents, please sign and return to me." You'd rather go, "Dear Mr. Fuji, the winter has been cold in the Northeast of the United States. How are things in Tokyo, or how are things in Osaka?" So basically some icebreakers before you send an email to Japanese colleagues, contacts, or distributors. I think we ran out of time now. I'd like to take some questions. Next slide was a story I was going to tell you, but I don't think we have time for that. So we'll go on to the question and answer period now, Robin. Thank you for listening to the presentation. Hope it was helpful. And if you have any specific questions, you can feel free to email me directly. Robin is able to provide that email address to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ames. I just want to let everyone know that after this webcast, I will be sending out an email that will include the handouts, post webcast survey link, how to access the RAPS learning portal to get access to the recording, and any additional information that is typical for this post webcast. We have a lot of questions to cover. If we do not get to all the questions, Ames will get a copy of the Q&A log, and he can respond directly to folks that are asking the questions. And we're going to start off with the first question from Jillian. Are you ready, Ames?
Yep.
Okay, what makes a KOL high quality? Are KOLs critical for all classes of devices, or only when clinical trials are involved?
Okay, good question, Jillian. So, I mean, if you have a class 1 device, you don't need a KOL. If you have a class 2 device and it's going, and it has a predicate device and it's going into the reimbursement category and you're okay with all that, yeah, KOLs may not be quite as important. The KOLs become more important for class 2 product, class 3 products and class 4 products, because the registration and the reimbursement allocations are normally more complicated. So I think if you have a class 3 or class 4 product, especially if it's going to the PMDA, having the right KOLs in place is crucial. It's very hard for foreigners to determine which KOLs are really top KOLs in Japan or not. That's why we always recommend that you find out from Japanese doctors or from a consulting company or somebody else about a Japanese KOL who can identify them in the pecking order at a certain hospital, and then also look for other KOLs in that specific sector, and then try to make sure that you find the right ones. So finding the right KOLs and finding the higher quality ones is just like an employee search. You have to check the backgrounds, the resumes, the reputations, et cetera. And that's important to do that, especially if you're trying to register a difficult product or get an increased reimbursement. I hope that answers your question.
Next question is from Milena. Under which class do dermal fillers and booster with hyaluronic acids fall?
That's a great question. Is it Milena? I'm sorry, what's the name?
Milena Minardi.
Milena? Yeah, I'm pretty sure those products fall into class 3. But if you would like to send me an email, I can confirm that, in the next week or so.
Okay. Next question is from Beth. Is there any guidance on how to locate a MAH-MAH?
Is there any guidance on that? Well, I mean, there are a number of MAH, DMAHs in Japan, basically independent third parties that can register your device product in Japan and act as your local representative in Japan. We offer MAH and DMAH services in Japan, but there are a number of other companies that do that too. So I think if you just go into Google and you put in Japan, medical device, MAH or DMAH, a number of companies will come up. And of course, just like looking for KOLs, you want to do your homework on the third-party MAH, DMAH companies, and then decide which one you'd like to work with.
Okay. Next question is from Greg Harris. Is QMS application more similar to ISO 13485:2016? And I hope I said that correctly.
Yeah, Greg, that's fine. Yeah, you said that correctly, Robin. So yeah, so it's pretty close to the ISO 13485, but there are some differences. And that's why we mentioned that in the presentation. There are some small differences. So you want to keep that in mind when you're doing your QMS. I think we had one slide which had an outline of the QMS requirements. And then I think, Greg, if you have some other questions beyond that, please let us know.
And Andrew asks, if you leverage your MDSAP certification during the QMS application process, are there any differences in the documentation required?
Right. So if you have the MDSAP, I mentioned that it will help you when you submit your QMS application, and it's less likely that you'll have an on-site audit and more likely you'll have a paper audit. But the QMS application can include the MDSAP, but there are some additional documents which we outlined during the presentation. So there will be more requirements than just the requirements for the MDSAP in the QMS Japanese application.
The next question is from Milena again. When is the registration of a raw material requested if it is a new raw material? Question.
Yeah, so I mean, the issue on doing master files for raw materials is a question for the manufacturer. If the manufacturer has a raw material which is unique, that has some intellectual property, and they need to provide that information to the final device manufacturer for product registration, but they don't want to do that because then the final device manufacturer will see the raw material in confidential information, then the raw material manufacturer of the medical device or component can submit a master file And in that case, the master file has the requirements that we had on the webcast today. Once the master file is submitted in Japan, you'll get a approval number, and then you can give that approval number to the final device manufacturer in Japan. And then by doing that, you don't have to give your confidential information on the raw material to the final device manufacturer when the final device manufacturer wants to register your product in Japan. So it's a way to keep your information confidential on the raw material and the processing of the raw material.
Okay, and Kurt Genowan has two questions. Is ISO 13485 a prerequisite to registering a medical product in Japan? That's the first question.
Yes.
Easy enough. The second question is, how can a company confirm whether its product qualifies for the SAKI Gate? I'm not pronouncing that.
Yeah, SAKI Gate. Yeah,
SAKI Gate process. Would that be in a Zen Pan Sodan, or is there a guidance document?
That's a good question. For the SAKI, yeah, and also on ISO 13485, I want to confirm that too. So Kurt, please send me an email on that. So in the SAKI Gate, whether you have a unique product that's going to be one of its kind and is meeting unmet needs in Japan would be the first criteria. So I think that first we have to do some evaluation if the product is really unique in Japan and meets some of the criteria for the SAKI Gate. If it does, to confirm that it's in the SAKI Gate, yes, we'd have to have a PMDA consultative meeting. I'm not sure which meeting that would be, but we can look into that for you too.
Next question is, can you apply for reimbursement in parallel with your medical device registration approval process?
Yes, normally the reimbursement decision is allocated after the registration, but today we've seen that you can start the reimbursement process as you've submitted your dossier for registration. So you don't have to wait till the device is approved now. You can start the reimbursement submission process, right after you submit the dossier. So it can be done more in parallel today in certain situations, especially if you have a unique product.
Next question is, what is the approval time for a line extension medical device in Class 4?
Okay, so basically we're talking about a change modification, I think, right? So we have a product that's approved as a Class 4 device, and now we want to modify the Class 4 product, I assume. So the time to get the modification approved, I think it really depends on the product and the situation, but I would say somewhere probably 6 months or so.
Okay, great. I got a question to post your email in the chat, and I'll get to that as soon as I can.
Okay.
The next question is, where can one find out the amount of Japanese reimbursement for a product in English?
It's not easy to find in English. So basically, we would have to do some analysis on the function. We'd have to do some translation into the functional category and check your product with the functional category in Japanese and then convert the answer to English. So I don't think there's information on functional category reimbursement in English today. And as I mentioned, there's a number of pages in a book that we'd have to look at to fine-tune the specific category of your product. So I'm not aware of any English documentation on that, but please send me an email and we'll check that.
Okay. We still have 10 questions remaining and about 2 minutes left, Ames.
Okay.
So we can go on a little bit past 12:30 if you choose. We'll leave
Sure.
that up to you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, the next question is from Christopher Kramer. Assume the cost effectiveness analysis must be done using cost assumptions from the Japanese healthcare system. That's a question.
Yeah, I mean, if we're trying to show that we want a higher reimbursement and we're going to show some cost evaluation data to show that we're saving money, unless the data is incredibly convincing, I would think you have to convert that over to a similar scenario in Japan, yes.
The next question is, I would like to go back to the slide we skipped over with regards to chemical material composition, if possible. This is a point I have been trying to drive home with regards to Japan, and I think it would be good to have a clarification on how this can be more stringent than what is required by other countries.
I'm not sure which slide they're referring to, but again, if the person can send an email, we'll try to answer that question over the next week or so.
And I've posted your email in the chat box for anyone that would
Okay.
like to email you.
Okay.
The next question is, can you tell about product changes to medical devices, class 4 and registration timelines?
Well, I think we said for the class 4 products, normally we're looking at about 2 years if no clinical trials are required, but for class 4 products, normally a clinical trial is required. So you'd have to add 1 to 2 years for the clinical study. So the time for the registration of a class 4 product with a required local clinical study could be anywhere between 3 and 4 years in Japan. What was the second half of that question?
Bear with me, I have to go down here.
Oh, the time for the
Class
change.
4 and registration timelines.
Yeah, so 3 to 4 years, including a local clinical study. And then I think, as I mentioned, for change modifications, normally about 6 months or longer, depending on the specific change in the specific product. So we'd have to look at that more closely.
Okay. The next question is, will the Japanese authority do an integrity review of the submitted documentation, or is this done by the MAH in Japan?
No, I mean, the PMDA is really evaluating all the documentation, not the MHLW. So in some cases, the MHLW will get involved, but normally it's done by the PMDA.
Okay, it's 12:31. How much more time would you like to spend on this, Ames? And
well, let's do a couple more. Let's do 2 more
Okay.
questions, and then we'll call it quits.
and to the audience, just remember that if he doesn't answer your questions, I will send the questions to him and he can respond later.
Yeah, the only point, Robin, there is that if people send questions, it's fine. We can try to get the answers, but it may take us a week to 10 days to get the
Okay,
answers.
good to know.
Right. They're a little
Thank
busy,
you.
so, right.
Appreciate that.
Okay.
The next question is from Peter Bauer. Reference pricing. What is the process if only U.S. pricing is available?
That's a good question. Well, if U.S. pricing, so for foreign reference pricing, if U.S. pricing is only available, it's going to make things a little trickier. As I mentioned, the Japanese see the U.S. prices as way too high, and they see the prices in Europe and Australia being lower. So I'm not sure exactly what will happen about that. If you want, you can send a question. I'm not sure there's a specific answer unless we discuss that with the PMDA, because on the reimbursement now, we haven't had any situations where there was just one US price. We've only seen situations where there were prices in Europe and the US. So I think the main thing is if there's just one US price, think about 70% of that price, 65% of that price. That's probably where the Japanese ballpark would be.
Okay, and this will be our last question for the webcast. It's from Anil Powers. For standalone SAMD, does Japan have any requirements for distribution importation for overseas manufacturers? Can the overseas manufacturer make the SAMD available to Japanese customers directly via the manufacturer website? Or does this SAMD need to be loaded onto a USB drive and shipped into Japan?
Well, that's a good question. If the product, so you can download software in Japan now to the customers if it's registered. So the question is, you still need to have a local agent in Japan. So you still need to have like a DMAH or MAH. So, and then you don't have to warehouse the software because it's not warehouseable. You can't warehouse the software in a storage facility, but you still will have to pay some DMAH fees because they're obligated for the quality control and the regulatory situation in Japan. So if the software is downloaded, it could be downloaded to the customers, but you're going to still need to have a local DMAH or MAH in Japan as your local agent.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Robin, and appreciate everybody coming today, and have a nice day. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you, Mr. Gross.